Welcome back to the Game, a Pax8 live show where Matt and I bring on a special guest every week and talk about cybersecurity shenanigans you need to know about. We have an amazing show this week with an amazing guest, our very own Eric Stevens from here at Pax8. We're going to talk to him later. We've got some incredible news to go over, a lot of stuff going on. Before we get into that, I've got two pieces of news. One, last week you heard Matt mention a glitch on the audio, and I think this fun fact is important to share for everyone. Turns out he had the live stream open next to our production, so he was hearing himself 6 seconds in the past. So that's super fun. As always, there's some buttons down there on YouTube. If the subscribe button is red, you're wrong. You need to click it, turn it gray, click the little bell next to it so you get notified every time. Let's roll straight into the news. Sorry, Matt, had to do it.
And it's codified and indemnified for forever at this point.
Yep. Gotta document the fun.
All right, let's stop making fun of Matt. Let's roll the news. So let's go ahead and throw up the news then for us, if you will, please. The first article is just kind of wrapping up. Researchers link multi-year mass credential threat campaign to Chinese hackers, and it's a group named Red Alpha. It's just one of those things where there's not a whole lot new in this. There's not a whole lot that we're starting to find out, but if you look at it, these are somewhat posthumously finding out that this campaign has been going on for a very long time. And I really wanted to just highlight that we always are finding adversaries that have worked as advanced persistent threats long after they've been advanced persistent threats in a lot of cases, right? And a lot of the threat actor data that happens is not necessarily known to the overall cybersecurity community until such time that we have enough data to be able to figure those type of things out. So it's just one of those common thoughts of everybody says, well, I'm not a victim or I'm not a big enough target. Oftentimes these type of actors start and find targets through connection points to other targets, right? And so the HVAC vendor of target methodology, if you will. But I really just wanted to open up and keep people reminded that, threat actors are constantly being found after the fact. And one of the biggest advocations I'd make out of this, Dom, is especially for MSPs. I just got done teaching our cybersecurity class on CIS, applying CIS controls with 13 MSPs. And the conversation is, depending on your level of risk, you need to be able to do that kind of research. You need to be able to do that kind of threat hunting. And it's very hard to do that if you're only using point products that consume and then make a decision and move on. Right? So this is probably one of the larger arguments, especially for service providers, to continue to have SIMs, to continue to get more and more normalized threat data in, right? So,
well, if it's on the news, it's not an APT anymore, right? We know about it. It's not quite as advanced. It's probably still persistent, but if it's news, we've discovered it. Somebody's unpacked it, right? Probably somebody that works for some company with 3 letters. It's not an APT anymore, and if you're hearing about it then and you're a victim, it's too late. Right, so look for abnormality. 100%. But also, I think a certain video game franchise is going to have to go cyber someday, and I hope there's a team on there called Red Alpha because I like it.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so next in the news, we've got a really interesting one. Comes out of the UK, and it's right there in the title. The NHS is working with UK cyber authorities to assess ransomware attack on an IT vendor. This is a repeat story. Definitely a global thing, right? I think we talk about a lot of U.S. incidents, but this is not a U.S. issue. This is a global issue. Service providers are a target. They will continue to be a target because of the economies of scale. And if you serve someone like the NHS or, I don't know, here, Health and Human Services, whatever, if you serve a large customer or a government customer like that, you're going to be a target. And I was reading into this one, and it's saying weeks or possibly a month before functionality can be restored. And it's impact to systems like ambulance dispatchers and appointment scheduling for going to the doctor and referring to specialists. The impact here is on real human life, right? So this is another case where we see cyber hitting real human life in a real way. And it's why we're here. It's why we talk every week, and it's why we're so serious about this. Is cyber and the real world are very close nowadays.
When you have this perfect correlation coming into play too, where, if you look at the first quarter report so far, we've seen less ransomware activity, we've seen less ransomware payments, we've seen less documented
Right.
breaches and ransomware events. And I think the reason is, and I read a really good article about this and did some speaking on this yesterday, but a lot of those reasons are that they're finding that the larger customers are more risky. They're looking towards force multipliers where they can get lots more out of the same work. You have regulatory challenges, you have governments aware of this, you have arrests, you have legal systems changing, all the things we've talked about on the game for the last
Right.
6 times, right? And those
Right.
things are playing out to where MSPs are seeing higher incidents of ransomware attacks than general companies. It's not a huge gap right now. I think MSPs grew by 93% in the stat that we prepared for our last exchange, and I think regular general SMB business grew by 80. But if you look at
Right.
that, if I was going to attack somebody, I'm going to find something where I get more bang for my buck. I'm going to find something where I have a force multiplier for what I can do. And if you look back, and I didn't quote this article, but in the same vein, we had one in the United States as well, right? Kyle Hanselman with Huntress came out and said about 3 weeks ago, hey, there's this person that says they have an initial access capability, right? So an initial access broker that found 100 VMware servers exposed, and they wanted to go halvesies, quote unquote, right, on a attack, saying, hey, Eric, why don't you help me out and you bring the ransomware? I have the connection to the assets. Let's go halvesies. So he put up half a Bitcoin, which is about $13,000, $12,500 or so, to prove that they were legit in escrow. And then a week and a half later, the Net Standard conversation comes up. And so Net Standard in Kansas City is believed to have undergone an attack from a ransomware event. I did a little digging, and I did a speech that I prepared called How I Would Hack You. And I went through the DNS dumpster and found 100 VMware servers with a vulnerable version that's subject to remote code execution unauthenticated, which is the holy grail, right?
Right.
And so now not only do they have this combination of publicly exposed servers, but it's the force multiplier. It's the if people aren't paying because they have better ransomware backup, and if people aren't paying because they have, well, let me get more of them at once so that I have a higher
Right.
incidence of those payments happening, right? And so you're
Right.
seeing it with NHS and the IT provider with NHS, but you see it every day, and it's demoralizing. But it's this call to action I want to make of start now. Be honest, transparent, and humble of where you are as an MSP. Start realizing the risk, and if you don't understand it, start leaning into it and learning it. Find ways to learn it, and start to understand how you can mitigate that risk, accept that risk, transfer that risk, right? The normal, healthy business conversation. I just think as
Right.
MSPs, and I'll get off my damn soapbox, but I just think as MSPs, we've gone so long making profit and trying to be efficient and trying to serve the technology needs and trying to serve. We haven't thought of this risk and this debt that's been building up. And I want to kind of bring that into our conversation, that this is a bit of a innovation debt and tech debt around MSPs, which is the very conversation we're going to be having in a little bit different lens with Eric here in a bit. But that brings us, I suppose, right on to what is tech debt, right? And I gave a couple of article links. They'll be in the comments below. But they're basically just kind of trying to codify some of these terms that we use all the time. Let me get to my article. That one's blurry enough I can't read it, so I apologize. Tech debt is also known as technical debt or code debt. Suggests that a simplistic, poorly understood, or quick and dirty solution. And I want to like zoom in on poorly understood as part of that. I feel like when it comes to the MSP lens, that's the biggest piece, right? In my cybersecurity class, I ask every MSP to rate themselves 1 to 10 in the beginning of the class. There was nobody under a 4. Everybody said, I got this. I'm a 7.
Right.
I'm an 8. Well, one of those 7s came back afterwards and said, I just want to say, I thought I was a 7 walking in, but I'm a 4, maybe a 3 in reality. And it wasn't that he got dumber from my class, I hope. I mean, maybe that is a possibility, right? I award you no points and may God have mercy on your
Right.
soul, Billy Madison style. But I think it's because there's these 3 buckets in life you live with. There's what you know, there's what you don't know, and there's what you don't know you don't know. The challenge is
Right.
we know what we know, or at least within the Dunning-Kruger principle, I suppose. And then there's the contextual side of what we can bring in from what we know that we must not know because we have contextual gaps in our understanding. So the don't know is pretty
Right.
easy too. But if you find yourself in a position where you have way more in your don't know you don't know bucket, there are no anchors to contextualize until the rake hits you in the face because you stepped on it. Or, right, you have
Right.
these things that become those anchors. So I feel like the understanding of security and the understanding of a poorly thought through is really just because the body of knowledge that we've had that we're responsible for has grown immensely through this security understanding. is my point. So tech debt is an anchoring piece that'll bring up our conversation with Eric. And in more simple terms, tech debt, in my opinion, and I'd love your thoughts on this real quick before we transfer, Dom, is tech debt is often the byproduct of a company making a product, go to market as a primary function, and we need to just get the code out the door. We'll fix it later. We have high dreams, high aspirations. We just got to get this vision done. But then the challenge is when you go back, you don't often have a healthy way to measure tech debt, to measure what you should have been doing that you haven't, and you often are measuring what's coming as real revenue. So my take on tech debt is a capitalism problem around technology in my mind today. What are your thoughts?
Oh, it definitely is, right? And I think if you launch an MVP and you start to bring customers on, whoever your consumer
What's an MVP?
Minimum viable product, right?
Yeah,
the,
man.
The code out the door, the first version of your software, right?
Yeah, man.
That you bring some customers on and they start asking for stuff, right? And like, hey, I'll pay you more if you add SSO, or I'll pay you more if you add this cool push notification thing. So you go to GitHub and you find some module to do push notifications for you, and you whip up something in Firebase. Well, you've just added some new tech debt, right? And if you're lucky, you put that in an org or in a list that goes to some demented Disney drawer somewhere, right? that nobody's ever going to touch because
Disney drawer.
because the evil Disney drawer doesn't poop money, right? So you're looking at the fancy Disney drawer that does generate cash, that does generate growth and revenue.
100%.
When you get to a certain scale, it's very hard to go to your stakeholders and say, I want to spend time on this. It's not a new feature, but man, it could kick us later on.
Epcot Center was way more sexy than repaving Minnie Mouse's corner, right? Like as you get into that from a drawing revenue perspective. And I think that's kind of the same roads challenges we have in community too, is the similar infrastructural challenges that come into tech debt. All right, next article, Rob. Let's keep it moving. All right. Is that my innovation debt article, or did I kick that in? Yeah, we zoomed in. No, it's okay. The next piece is around innovation debt. So one of the challenges, and we'll bring that article back up or not, but one of the challenges, innovation debt, is failing to invest in new technologies that can improve services. So you have on one hand tech debt. I created something. I know it has a gap. I know it has a weakness. I need to move forward and fix it, but I have to continue the mission, right? Where innovation debt actually speaks towards a different type of death, right? And I think they're correlated, but innovation debt says, hey, I can't keep ahead of things because I'm not innovating, and I have this innovation debt that eventually puts me far behind as well. But the reason I bring up innovation debt and what I want to talk about there is innovation debt can be a byproduct of, thank you guys, I gave you all the wrong link or something, but the innovation debt can be a byproduct of tech debt. Imagine you had some monolithic code application that you can't rewrite easily. It's very, very dependent on its methodologies, and you want to do something new or fun with it. You'd have to look at potentially, how am I going to wedge that in here without having to compromise what all needs to be done to do that, right? And so you then end up creating, I think, more tech debt and bolting old tech debt into new innovation, and therefore keeping it worse and worse. And Eric and I were talking earlier, and I'll give a really good example kind of that down the road. But what are your thoughts on the difference between tech debt, as we normally talk about it, and innovation debt, Dom?
It comes down, for me, it comes down to innovations in the industry as a whole and the way we look at how things are developed, right? Like microservices wasn't a thing when Rage was making an accounting package that was very SQL client based, and it was very one fat app and one monolithic database. And it was like adding a feature to that is huge, right? You're doing so much to do that. Nowadays, I look at it more like, if you want to avoid innovation debt, you're going to start building on day zero with modern architecture. So I definitely feel like a lot of that nowadays can be avoided if you carefully plan how you start, right? But a lot of people don't do that. Back to the MVP theory. It's like, I want to crank an MVP out and start making money. I'll build it monolithically, and I'll just build a big, huge code base, and then they have to go back and redo it.
Well, and I know we're poking Eric right now because he can't pop in and tell us how wrong we are about some of these things. So it's going to be perfect to get that here in a bit. But the other piece, I'll put it in the SMB focus. Let's just look at the difference. Mm-hmm. Innovation is the ability to, in my mind, fail. It's the ability to fail fast, to learn from it, and make something new, right? And serve some need or serve some business function. Innovation comes from failure, and Eric and I were talking about this pre-show. But think about the failure speed. Here, I'm going to paint two scenarios. One, you have a server running on bare metal. You add another bare metal server every time you want to do something, or heaven forbid, add some services to it, right? And you now are going to try out a new enterprise resource planning, or ERP product. Well, now I need to buy a server. I need to spin up the resources that I have. I need to work with that team to get it implemented. I got to wait on my MSP to get that project planned. I got to step forward. And then eventually, once we're 6-7 weeks and $20,000 into this, we realize it's not the one. I don't think that's going to work for me. I think we'll probably now imagine that's one method of growth and innovation. And now you say, I have all Azure AD. I'm 100% Intune. I'm 100% Microsoft Cloud. I want to turn on some SaaS application. I'm going to turn on Dynamics. You literally do a provisioning and turn it on. It's available for you within the first 5 minutes, and you can start iterating on that very quickly and fail very quickly and eventually go, no, that ain't for me. But the more ain't for me's and the more this doesn't serve my purpose you can ingest and understand and move forward, the faster you're able to build towards what that answer really is. And I think just to try to put it in that position, if you were in the tech debt situation of saying, I don't have any cloud products, I'm not tied to Azure AD, I couldn't absorb this into my environment, I can't, then you're going to have to choose to do it this way, or you're going to have to choose to do it somewhat poorly this way. And that's kind of my point, is that there's a big difference in that. And yeah, innovation debt, we'll dig into it. We brought on an expert of this and one of our people inside that is leading most of our charge for innovation around our own technical capabilities. So let's not wait any longer. Let's bring up Eric Stevens. What is up, brother?
Hey guys, nice to see you again. Thanks for having me on the show. I gotta say, if you can one person to go really deep on technical debt, I'm really good at producing that. I can produce tons of technical debt all day, every day.
Thanks. That's at least fair. This is one of those safe groups where you tell on yourself first, and we're going to be good, Eric. So Eric, tell me about yourself. What led you here? You're our senior VP of engineering, right? You run our world, and you're part of delivering Chasen's vision, our CTO. But what? Tell me about yourself. Tell me a little bit about your history. Go into it. People want to know.
Yeah. Thanks for asking that. I've got kind of an interesting history that I don't often talk about and need to. I'm leading cybersecurity engineering at Verizon for Verizon Business Group. I had about 39 products globally around the world, and I found myself there because the Verizon had purchased our startup called ProtectWise back in 2018. And 2019 closing dates, and so that was also a cybersecurity solution there. That's how I found myself in that space there. In that space, we did a lot with really, really big data analytics. I mean, the platform we had built was a real-time cybersecurity analytics platform that ingested about 500 billion, about 500 billion data points each hour for real-time analytics, and then we would store it and index it and make it retrospectively available. And this was we're actually talking about full network packet solution, like full network packet stream to the cloud with unlimited retention was the basic value prop of that product space. So if you imagine that on numerous multi-gig cores and things like that, it's a lot of data. It adds up really, really fast. Yeah. So coming into Pax8, I've been here just a little bit over a year. I think the thing that we see there is this is a little bit of an industry shift for me. I moved out of cybersecurity, which I've been in for a number of years, and moved into Pax8's unique part of the market here. But there's some amazing principles that we can take, ideas that we can borrow from cybersecurity space that we can bring into business and enterprise and MSP space. And I think especially increasingly, the importance and criticality of security, especially in the partner space, is utterly amazing. Is utterly through the roof. This is so important to us. And truthfully, our MSPs are being very actively targeted and attacked all the time. So I'm really glad to be having these kind of conversations, because these are the kinds of entry points that modern attackers get into organizations through, is to deliberately pick on the parts of your organization that if you had a magic wand, you'd probably wave and make not look like that anymore. Not everybody has that
Right.
flexibility in their life. Like better or worse, whether you like it or not, like that's the practical truth, pragmatism of what some people have to face themselves with. And I think there's a lot that Pax8 can do to bring some really amazing insights into that space there. So this merging of cybersecurity engineering and sort of business process engineering and bringing that all together into one space is just been a really, really excellent confluence of the availability of amazing features that we can put together there. It's some really cool stuff that we can build in the future that we probably can't talk about yet today.
Yeah, fair. Well, and tell me, so you said before you broke up, you wound up at Verizon, right? As 500 million packets an hour, which is just mind-boggling. But what's your backstory? Where did you come from? Like, kind of get in a little bit of, and you can go all the way back to birth if you want. It gets a little complex in those early years telling the story, but you can certainly push it forward a few. But tell me a little bit more about your history, brother.
I was born at a very young age. Turns out, no,
Zero.
Prior to that, like,
yeah.
Well, I mean, for me, I'm an overachiever. I was born at 3 months, but sorry. Prior to that, after running, kind of running engineering at ProtectWise for a number of years, that was really interesting. Big data problem spaces and some security spaces inside of there. Previously, I actually also ran, or at least was the technical lead on platform for e-commerce in the healthcare space, and it was about like a $7 to $8 billion platform, which is way more impressive than it sounds, because that's the kind of platform that you get individual orders for $350 million on a credit card, because it's the CDC or something like that. That's healthcare for you, right? But it's a big space, and tying into big global ERPs and global distribution network and all of the adversarial stuff that you see how product is shipped and sent around the world, especially from a healthcare perspective and so forth. My focus there wasn't really around the cybersecurity elements of it. It was really around the e-commerce spaces of it. But the cybersecurity elements, the physical security elements of that, my part of the world was a vaccine company shipping vaccine supplies to people. It goes over, traditional public logistics networks like FedEx. And how do you have any kind of guarantee that product gets there and has integrity from like a cold chain issue, supply issue, and other things like that? There's a lot that can go wrong with that sort of stuff, and there's a lot therefore that can be attacked sort of adversarial on the inside of those spaces.
Yeah, for sure.
So big e-commerce, leading big cybersecurity, especially like all of these are definitely big focus around big data, and all of those spaces. This is, not to hark back to the topic du jour too aggressively here, but all of those spaces are spaces where we're trying to move really fast. We're trying to move faster than the industry. Healthcare, for example, in the vaccine space, a few years ago, you may recall, there was really hard to find flu shots and things like that.
Yep.
Those are gigantic adversarial issues for us. And all of this, like very suddenly having to respond to what the emerging conditions in the industry look like. The one year we found ourselves 2 weeks before we were ready to start distributing vaccine product for the seasonal product. We found that our sole competitor just got decertified, and now we were the single provider for the world, which sounds like a great problem to have from an economic perspective, but from a
logistics
business distribution
Right.
perspective,
That's right.
it's terrible, right? Because you're a doctor, and what's the very first thing you're going to do when you hear, oh, there's a shortage of vaccines? You're going to go and try to get as many vaccines to cover your patient as you possibly can. Right?
It's the toilet paper problem in the pandemic, right? Like that's a byproduct of that exact behavior.
Right.
Yeah. That's awesome. And I think you told me a story that I don't want to miss. Well, I don't want to miss this story too. And then Dom's got a question for you. But one of the things you talked to me about earlier was how you kind of got into business in general. I just don't want to miss that for our audience. I think it was something around janitorial services, as I understood, correct? Or if I misquoted.
That's true. That's part of my background that I don't always talk about. But that's how I put myself through college. It was when I first got out of high school. I didn't have any financial support for college. I needed to earn some cash, and you're a fresh high school grad. There's not that many ways you can make just a ton of cash, and janitorial services is one of them. As far as zero required previous skill set coming into it, that's a great way to do it. I in the mid 90s, I was making $10 an hour. That was just, I was living the dream as far as that goes. With my high school diploma, and so forth. But however, in that that's the pharmaceutical that I ended up working in e-commerce at. So I went from pushing
Nice.
the
That
broom
works out.
on the floors of that place. I ended up like growing up into their graphics department, because that's where web development was done in the 90s. It was in graphics, right? And then so that was the graphics and print shop. So sometimes I had enough coding to keep me occupied, and sometimes it was go run some presses or run the paper cutter or run the shrink wrap machine or something like that. Man, it's just whatever you needed to do to get it done. And it's just been kind of like this daisy chain of events from there, just building on prior experience year after year, role after role, in order to find myself in this position. And so I have this continuous string of events that I can tie all the way back to pushing a broom, and when I first got out of high school. And I can probably even tie it back a little bit more to my high school job, where the referral from that boss is what got me my janitorial job. Like, I got a referral in the mid 90s that I've been riding ever since.
That's so awesome. I wanted to touch on the reason why it mattered to me. The reason it mattered to me is my son, who's 18, just graduated high school. I've paid for his car. I've paid for his house. I've paid for everything. But I'm making him put himself through college. I don't exactly qualify for a lot of Pell Grants for him based on my economic status, but I'm not paying. And I will tell you, watching him over this last 6 months prepare to pay that first semester and be ready for it and all that, boy, he's going to walk in that class and get something out of it. Right. And I think that's kind of one of those concepts. So I was really happy to hear and to see your success level and some of the stuff you've done.
And the life skills he's getting out of that are huge.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I would imagine he's doing some level of work.
I probably learned more than anything about human respect in that role, to be completely honest. That's the hidden. Every role you have, there's always some secret to learn. In janitorial services, learn about human respect. Because if you ever are in that position, you're on the receiving end of that, you realize that it's much more material than you think it is.
You either grow empathy or you either grow empathy or you're a great sociopath. Like one of the two, right? Like out of that concept.
A little from column A, a little from column B sometimes.
A little bit both. It's okay. So an interesting fact about you was leaked to me by someone, and it's kind of perfect because our show is called The Game. And I'm told that you've built a game, but I think beyond that, you've studied game theory. So I want to hear a bit about that because it's interesting and it also fits the show perfectly.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Don. It's one of those stories that's also like mixed case of like of it, and I'm also kind of embarrassed about it. So like, I have this saying, like, if you ever go back and look at any of your old code and you're satisfied with what you saw, like you like your old code, then you're not growing it out.
Yeah.
The good news is, like,
see my
PowerShell.
It's ugly.
This story is direct to that because I in my youth, my very first like real serious open source exposure was the building and creation of an open source video game, or more probably appropriately like a text-based MUD that was in the browser. So this was post-MUD days, early browser days that didn't exist back then. I was trying to create something. And so I had this old BBS door game that I loved called Legend of the Red Dragon. And it was just like one of my favorite games as a kid.
I played Lord.
I love that game. Man.
Oh, that's awesome.
You gotta love that game.
That the other day.
Seth Abel Robinson.
Yeah.
Oh man,
so good.
I loved that game as a kid. I wanted to build a clone, and so I built Legend of the Green Dragon, which I've creatively named.
Of course,
I should have named it
correlate that.
Yellow Dragon. Like if I'd named it Yellow Dragon, it would have been opposed to LOGD. You can't pronounce it. So that bad marketing choice on my part. Maybe that's why I work at Pax8 instead of having gotten into.
You got logged instead of Lord.
Right.
yeah, but I do for LogD. If you guys are looking for the domain name.
Oh,
let's talk.
So cool.
So anyway, Legend of the Green Dragon was as an honorarium to the Legend of the Red Dragon game, and awesome. It was built all in the browser, and I ran it as open source. It was the early days of the LAMP stack, so like Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, right before LAMP stack.
Did you do any of the ANSI graphics that were? Did you do any of the ANSI graphics that were in Lord, like the little the tavern scene and the?
In fairness, I got to point. It's worth pointing out that those weren't part of Lord. Those were part of Lord's plugin system.
You're right. I didn't Which do actually comes back to your conversation, a little bit. So, but anyways.
Well, it does actually, because I think the Legend of the Green Dragon turned out to be relatively popular in certain spaces. It's actually turned wildly popular in Germany. We had more installs of that there in Germany than anything. It's localized into German and other languages as well by open source community members. And I think part of the reason why we got relatively eager interest in the whole program was because we had built a plugin system into it. So like anybody could come and bring brand new game content in there. We had kind of like a marketplace online that people could buy and trade, or like not buy, like it wasn't like no money was trading hands, but like people would trade plugins with each other or trade features. Like, hey, can you add this feature to the plugin that you wrote? I really like it, and I'll add something. Like people, there was lots of negotiations going on, like that sort of stuff all around. And for all people, it's like, here's a game engine that's up and operational. It's very simple. It's text based. You can reason about it very, very easily, and you can build content without having to worry about all of how the technical stuff works under the hood and so forth. And we had thousands and thousands of those kind of plugins that were built out there. And for a whole bunch of people, this was their very first time learning how to program it. Kind of like lowered the bar to make it easy enough to enter that you only need to learn like 6 or 7 commands. Yeah, a little bit. I mean, in PHP, but yeah. So, and it was pretty popular. So ultimately, like I think the highest stat I ever saw on that was we had about 70,000 concurrent online players across the set of all the installs of this. So it was open source. Anybody could run and install, and then we built a network that the game servers could communicate with each other and just have a sense for what other game servers there were out there, and try to create kind of democratic discovery of game servers for other people. It was an open source mentality, right? Kind of leaning into that stuff, and like the peak that I ever saw was like about 70,000 concurrently online humans playing this game all around the world. It was kind of fun.
Yeah. That's crazy. So the title of this show is Innovation Debt, Eric. And I really want to give you the stage on this I'd love to hear, and the audience would as well. What does that mean? Like, what does innovation debt mean to you? Help me understand how you focus on and understand that conversation.
It's a newer term. Like we haven't talked that much about in the industry about innovation debt specifically. The word tech debt has been around for decades. It's probably
a drinking game now.
I think it probably is, and it's probably more poorly understood than most people realize, just because it's the same thing as other tech terms, agile and other things like that. Like lots of people use that terminology, and they probably mean similar things, but they have nuanced differences in how we think about it amongst each other and so forth. And I think technical debt is in that same kind of camp, is what one person hears when they hear technical debt, and what another person is saying when they say technical debt. They may not be super well aligned in all cases there. So that's why I think it's really important to have these open conversations about these sorts of things, so that we can kind of understand where are other people's heads in this space. But for me specifically, start with technical debt, because I see them as elements of the same spectrum to each other. Technical debt as a better understood space, I think, at large, we look at it as the work that if you had nothing else to do and you wanted to just really complete this all the way through, and so you're super duper happy with it, and when you get to the point where you're like, I just literally have nothing else I would touch on this, then you have no technical debt. And anybody who's ever actually worked on a real product knows that the world never exists. Even if you realistically have multiple years to work on a very small feature set, and you don't have to worry about scope creep and other things like that, realistically, you'll never ever will run out of things you want to work on. So technical debt is inevitable. It's unavoidable. It's omnipresent in everything that you do. Even if nothing else, even if you've got that to a perfect space, you wait a couple of weeks and bit rot of some kind is going to come along and affect you. Is a library that you're depending on that has a new vulnerability in it, or a new piece of technology. It's like, hey, we have to keep on the leading edge of this stuff. From a UI perspective, or from a data analytics perspective, or other spaces like that. If you want to stay in the leading edge of that, and you ever stop moving forward, then that realistically means you're going backwards. It's a lot easier to defend that mentality in the cybersecurity space because it's adversarial and people are trying to get ahead of you, right? Like standing still is moving backwards. Moving forwards is moving backwards if you're not moving forward fast enough. That's really more about where it starts to lean into innovation debt. Then is how do you get ahead of the stuff that you haven't started working on yet, right? Like, and that's how do you work on stuff you haven't worked on? It's complicated, right? You need to be thinking about what's coming next, and importantly, it's really important for organizations to create the capacity, because innovation can come from anywhere. And innovation comes from frontline contributors, line workers, from management, from executives, from customers and partners, wherever. It comes from all over the place. that's, you've got to be able to open your mind to all of that stuff. You got to be able to listen. There's lots of stuff that we see in the product spaces around that stuff. But I think, Matt, this leans into something that you and I have talked about before too, is like, what's this, your middle, it's not middle out theory. That's
my middle theory.
that's Silicon Valley.
I'll give everybody real
The
quick.
middle theory.
So my middle theory. So the point is that if you think about any product, I don't care if it's a cup, if it's a Pellegrino bottle, because I happen to have one here and I just think like that, but I don't care what it is. Your product will never, ever rise much, much above the consuming entity's maturity and their desires, or much below. If you're much below, capitalism somewhat solves that. You eventually lose. If you're much above, capitalism solves that too, and there's no benefit to being above. And what I mean by that, if you take this into innovation and tech debt, if your maturity of your consumer doesn't care about how you've built your code, doesn't have any level of understanding, doesn't dig into staying up with modern practices or the impact of risk or any of that, then you're never incentivized to deal with that. And so as a result, that rapid maturity, back to what you were talking about, Eric, that you and I were chatting about earlier, if you ever find yourself with tech debt and innovation debt, maybe you're not advancing fast enough, you're certainly not walking faster than what you're creating in that way, that doesn't kill you. However, what's a static cost today with a low interest rate, when you have a very high consumer maturity, an instantly high or artificially high in some way, instant maturity, then you now have an asymptotic increase in that cost for that tech debt, right? In the sense that you have people leaving you and finding new solutions that are solving it, and leaving because you're not innovating. And as they leave, you continue to die the death of an equity loss. You continue to die the death of a slowdown and inability to get more funding to fix these things, less focus on those things. And so, yeah, it ties into my middle theory. Thank you. That's awesome. I'm going to write a book one day. You just help me advance it. You're the man. No, seriously though.
Yeah, if I get a byline on it, I'll throw in on it.
Oh, done.
Yeah, no, but
Done.
like that. Oh, I think I just committed myself to something. Can we? This is live.
This is
It's
live.
It's unfortunate. Yeah. And
witnesses.
perfectly
Yeah,
recorded
shoot,
forever.
no taking that one back then, is there? Okay. Yeah, no, but like the thing is, I think it's also important to understand a couple of things about technical debt and these types of debt. One is that we call them debt for a reason, is that there's an interest rate to be paid. If so, you can ignore this, and you can ignore this for an unlimited amount of time, but the longer you ignore it, the more expensive it's going to get. And importantly, unlike most financial loans that you could get today, where there's some minimum commitment that you have to do month over month, that is not true in technical debt. You can ignore it all day long, every day, and that interest will accumulate. So you're going to pay interest on your interest.
It might be a balloon payment.
I mean,
but it will accumulate, right? Like at some point, it may just punch you. And here's an example.
At some point, it comes to
Netflix versus Blockbuster. If you look at a gap in innovation capabilities at Blockbuster, Netflix grew, right? But even in that same vein, you gave me a fantastic conversation earlier, Eric, when we were talking about this, about how Netflix had their own challenge around innovation debt. And I hope this helps make more sense. And what I mean by that is, you said it well earlier. Netflix was told, hey, everything you're putting out's a winner. Every show you've made early on is crushing it, right? Why don't you finish that statement? Because I don't think I'll do it as good a justice for you as you did. But
the problem, this was Reed Hastings. Love him or hate him, like he's certainly got some interesting business ideas around this. And the early days of Netflix beginning to produce some of their own content, which they were doing in response to shifts in the industry. They were responding to an innovation debt that they had. I mean, good on them for recognizing that and being ahead of it. They realized that if they weren't able to produce their own content, then they were always going to be begging other people for access to their content, and they were always going to be in the in the losing position, the default losing position from that perspective. So in order for them to innovate, they started producing their own content. Everybody knows this. Netflix has tons and tons of shows. But what not everybody knows is their early days, there were a ton of shows that, and other people probably had this experience as well, that I loved, that they canceled. And like, I don't understand why you would cancel such an amazing show. And the reason why is because they looked at the aggregate of all of the Netflix studios content, and they realized that we're winning almost every show. And what that means is that we're not creating new value. We're not innovating in this space. We're distilling the values down that other people have produced. We're refining other people's formulas, but we're not creating new formulas of our own. And that made them very vulnerable. And so it's, from a business perspective, from the outside, lots and lots of people had good reason, myself included, to be kind of upset about this business decision. We're going to deliberately cancel existing, known, successful content because we need to create room for stuff that actually innovates, stuff that where we don't know that it's going to be successful when we launch it. And in response to that, if you look at it from the outside, you see, hey, look at all these great shows Netflix canceled, only to replace them with a whole bunch of garbage shows. Like, what on earth is the business justification behind that? But it's because they learned, right? Like, they learned what works and what doesn't work in that content. And if all you have is a working formula and you have no ability to play around with a mix of that and an ability to understand why it works the way that it works, it's great that you stumbled onto a great formula, but it means that anybody else can come and copy it because you don't actually understand what you're doing on the inside there. And that, I think, is realistically what innovation debt is getting, like, resting on your laurels too much and depending too much on the well-known state of the system and not being willing to get in front, experiment and innovate, right? Like, what does innovation require? Is experimentation, and what experimentation require is failure, right? And so if you can't,
exactly,
in the Netflix case, they weren't failing, so they weren't learning, and that was the problem that they had. And like, optically on the outside, it looks like such a terrible business decision, but on the inside, it's like, this is how we defend ourselves against being able to be cannibalized by somebody else. Somebody else can't come in and just repeat what they see us doing because they don't understand why we're doing it.
I want to bring this out of the higher, more theoretical business that doesn't necessarily correlate to MSPs, but I want to give an example. So we've all heard us talk about Bob's Law before, right? Bob Coppage says that 5% of everything you do is commoditized every year, which means you have to innovate. And if you look at that, there are MSPs that leaned really early into adding strategic services, right? If you remember early on in MSPs, you were doing optimization, right? Back to your point with Netflix, they got really good at making that show every time and doing it the same way. They got really good at efficiency. MSPs got great at dealing with efficiencies and economies of scale and things like that that came into play, right? But the innovation gap that would have been there is if MSPs hadn't pivoted to start understanding and flexing the muscles of a VCIO. And flexing the muscles of being able to go lead what you're deciding on in the business decisions for technology ahead of the time when I'm just picking up the debt from the decisions, right? And I kind of wanted to bring that down into something that MSPs can follow and understand and see. And now we're in that space with how do we deal with security? Is there a vCISO role? Is there some fractional CISO? Is there a partnership? Is there that innovation is continuing to move along, and the companies that don't have built up innovation debt and then sometimes technical debt as well at the same time, right? I was talking to a partner today that says, I'm not going to really do the security thing. I know I love how much you've grown. It was Sheldon Phillips was talking about a competitor. And Sheldon's grown by 400% since then. His EBITDA is in the 60% range. His support costs have gone down by 40%. And this other company's going, the wife goes, we need to do that. And he goes, no, I'm happy with what we're doing. There is a time where tech debt becomes a balloon payment. Right. And when the tech debt and innovation debt make that you can't pay that payment, if you will.
Right.
Yeah. And importantly, not all tech debt is necessarily fundamentally evil. When you guys talked earlier about MVP, which you called minimal viable product, and that's the right expansion of that phrase. But one of the expansions that we've started switching to internally for ourselves has been minimal viable prototype, because product sounds more complete. And
I like it.
What we talk about in MVP is like, we just want to know, can we test this idea in the industry? Is there merit to this? That's what we're trying to figure out, right? And if you build a full featured product that has all of the user management capabilities and whatever else that you need on the back end to have a full featured product, and you test your entire hypothesis around that product only after you have all of those pieces completely in place, and you're wrong about it, it's extremely expensive to recover from it. From that space, you lose
and
your
that
entire
would
investment.
That's my new definition. Yeah, I'm sticking with that for MVP
I love it
from now on.
Yeah, it's like, and there's not like a small amount of material on that subject out there. This is a pretty well known kind of space at least inside of engineering and cybersecurity engineering anyway.
Yeah, I love it. Well, the other half of our show title is technical debt, and we've kind of talked about how innovation debt and technical debt can be closely related, and how you tend to accrue them together, or one causes you to accrue the other. And I think the important piece of that conversation, to your point, Eric, you could ignore it for a real long time, but like Matt said, it's going to come after you, right? The collectors are going to come; they're going to want all of it at once. But let's talk about technical debt. And a lot of times when we talk about technical debt, we're talking about specifically in the lens of cybersecurity. We tend to pick on such and such vendor charges an extra 600% for single sign-on, or such and such silly code vulnerability exists in something that shouldn't have existed, right? Because it was MVP, it was cobbled together, and that was there. And I think there's without naming specific examples, we've found vendors in past incidents, and they knew that problem was there for a long time before it was exploited. So from the lens of Pax8, how do we look at technical debt and stay ahead of that curve, specifically when it comes to us as a chink in the supply chain, or a link in the supply chain, I should say, and how do we stay ahead of that curve and let's peel back the curtain a little bit, not too far, but a little bit.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something that I spent a lot of time thinking about. There aren't any like super easy answers there, because otherwise everybody would just do that, right? But there's a lot of spaces I think that we lean into our unique differentiations on this front. As Pax8, like we have really good relationships with our vendors all around the board. I think there's very few vendors that we have a business relationship with that we aren't like deeply in bed with each other, that we understand each other, we have regular communications, and so there's a lot of sharing of best practices back and forth, and those sorts of things are very obvious and simple stuff that you can do. But realistically, you have to always be thinking in the future. You always have to be leaning into what's coming next. It's not okay to be responding to the changes in the industry. You have to be in front of them. You look at was it Twilio recently that the only reason that they got saved was because they had moved away from just pure TOTP, time-based OTPs, into hardware OTPs, like YubiKeys in their case, I think. And they didn't need to. Nothing drove them to require that. It was a step up in security, and then all the stuff that you can imagine about from that perspective. Great kudos to them, because another supplier in their space did not have YubiKeys, had TOTP, and fell victim to an attack that was directed spear phishing style at both companies, very, very deliberately targeted at their specific pieces of infrastructure meant to look exactly like their operations. So even when employees clicked on that link and tried to fill out the information, the hardware OTPs stopped the attack, and that was innovation from them. They got ahead of this.
Right.
They weren't required to. Nothing drove them to, but they said, this is more secure. Let's move to that before we're forced to. And in this case, they protected themselves against a class of attack that had never been done before.
Right.
So I want to stop real quick, because we've used the crud out of OTP and TOTP and HOTP, and right. So let's touch real quick. So what's OTP? And I'm going to make you answer this one.
OTP is one-time pad. It's a reference back to the early cryptographic days of World War II.
Yep.
There's a great book that I'm going to plug right now. It's The Girl Who Smashed Codes. It's a book about Elizabeth Friedman, one of the early women cryptographers. She was in World War II in Bletchley Park. Her husband got a lot of credit for the stuff she did. One of my personal heroes. So you're going to bring that up. I'm going to say that. And why are they called one-time pads? Is because they had a literal physical piece of paper that had cryptographic, like, well, here's the secret key for this one message, and when you use it, you throw it away, you destroy it, you burn it, whatever, you get rid of it, and your very next message uses the next pad. So like, even if you crack the cryptography around one, the next one you have
only
to
good
crack
for the
from
ones.
zero again. That's the
and
idea. In security space today, TOTP is time-based OTP, and so this is a code that rotates based on time. And so typically 30 seconds to a minute, something like that. The earliest implementations of these are those old RSA secure ID key fobs, if you remember those.
RSA tokens.
Yeah. So like that's it. It's a great way to provide security. It covers the factor of something you have. In this case, in the traditional space, so 3 factors of security: something you are, something you have, something you know. It's the something you have. And so you can provide one of those 2 other factors to provide really solid identification of yourself, or all 3 factors to have extremely high confidence: something you are, something you know, and something you have. Very hard to fake that.
And the unique part about that is, if you were looking at this from a compliance perspective, if you as Twilio were doing this to check the box, do you have MFA? Yep, I have TOTP.
Right.
But instead, they focused on innovation. They focused on security innovation. They focused on staying ahead of the curve. And as a result, they had hardware-based YubiKeys. And I just double learned this again when I was testing Evil Genix. I have a YouTube video you can go look at on cybermattlee. But that YouTube video is of me demoing stealing tokens just like that with an Evil Genix man in the middle or adversary in the middle attack. And I can steal them every day with Microsoft Push. I can steal them every day with TOTPs. I can steal them every day with Authenticator. You know what I can't steal them with? With YubiKeys. It fails because the only callback URL has to be Microsoft, which means I cannot be in the middle. I can't be a proxy agent in that. And so it literally just ends it. But in addition, it's faster. I don't have a long password. I have a pen and then I tap it. That's something I know can be shorter because it's only effective when it's with something I have. And you start seeing a very interesting thing. But the point being, they got ahead of tech debt. They got ahead of innovation debt. Yep. Dom's like 20 of them. I got 4. Mine's a little green plastic. But mine's in my wallet. It'd take too long.
Oh, you got the nano.
But the point is that this is an example of where tech debt came calling to their competitor and came calling to them, and they were not subject to it. They had already stayed ahead of it.
They got ahead on innovation, and they protected themselves. And especially in cybersecurity, it's adversarial system, right? That means that you're the bad guys. They are getting ahead of you. If you're not getting ahead of them, then they are getting ahead of you.
100%.
Now imagine being an MSP though, and like you do that. You implement hardware authentication in your infrastructure. Like you get to some magical state where everything's Azure AD, single sign-on, et cetera, which we're not there yet, right? Just not all the tools supported, but we're getting there slowly. Is what it is. But let's say you get there and then you do implement hardware and a similar type attack happens, right? We're using Evil Genix, we're using some sort of proxy, we're targeting MSPs in a very sophisticated way. Person down the street, pop for it, brutal, do an incident response, but you're like, nah, customers, we use these fancy key things. By the way, you should use them too, but it stopped that. Like what? That's an incredible story, right? Twilio gets to brag about that to their customers, one of which I think we're a Twilio customer, right? But they get to brag about that in their market. If you're an MSP, you should be, if you're doing proactive things to be better than you were yesterday, you should be talking about that. And every sales pitch and conversation with existing customers, you should talk about, like, we pay attention to this and we innovate, right? Use the Twilio story, implement this internally and say, hey, we saw this happen. We saw this company get ahead of it this way. We read into it and said, man, we should do that. And we did it. That's incredible PR, let alone all the security benefits.
Yeah. And I'm focusing this at you, MSPs. I want to make sure you understand, in this instance, your tech debt and your lack of innovation growth and innovation debt are what creates the scenario where you're the force multiplier for your customer. And so while I think we have to guide them down that path too, and we have to go that way, start with you, be humble, be transparent, ask for help, reach out to peers, learn, grow, educate, and be better than you were yesterday. Eric, you said something earlier that just triggers me, because when I would go back and look at my tech work, I would almost vomit watching what I had built a year ago, right? Like, I hated it. I was so disgusted with what I had built and how dumb I was. And I think the point is it's because I was always trying to push myself to understand something more, or to grow, or to be better, or to innovate, or to change, or to not suck, right? And as you get through that, you should be looking back and going, man, what a difference. How insecure were we last year? How poorly were we delivering this message? And if you take innovation debt, it's not always technical. Sometimes you have challenges you have to overcome in order to innovate. And what I mean by that is, let's say as you're thinking about protecting your customers with tools, you want to move to this stack, or you want to do this service, or you want to move this thing. You can sometimes have an inability to innovate in how you teach, innovate in how you communicate, how you drive the market, how you educate that partner. And so innovation and tech debt aren't always directly in the IT and the technical. They can be in things like, hey, I had a company today. They reached out to me, old company I used to support, and they were still on Exchange. And they were trying to work with someone and they couldn't, because they couldn't communicate with Teams and they didn't have the things they needed. And they actually lost a contract and finally said, damn it, let's get to Microsoft. I mean, we're 9 years past when people started going to Office 365, right? Or 7, or whatever it is. Right. You start getting in the reality that these things will come up, and they will be real debt that costs you business and or is a loss, right? And then the other thing I want to add real quick before we close up is, I've been investigating a lot of autonomous pen test platforms lately, which I hate the term, but the concept is, if we know these techniques and we can automate them, we can make these techniques work well enough to help you understand your risk. And when I said, hey, listen, I want someone to help me do a red team exercise with Pax8. So I'd love to work with these companies and see if someone has some great ways to make that faster. And when I ask them, do you have anything that looks directly at Azure AD, and attacks that side of it, man-in-the-middle proxies, identity-centric proxy attacks, things that are very modern attacks against an identity-centric world. Their answer was, oh yeah, we do. You just go to the AD server, and then we're going to dump LSAS, and then we're going to compare those credentials against Microsoft Azure AD, and then if it, wait a minute, what if I didn't have that? I don't have that at Pax8. I don't have a server that is our authoritative server. We're using and consuming modern identity sources. And so when you get into that conversation, even some of the threat actors are very limited in what they can do on that front edge capability compared to what they could do with all the modern techniques that used to exist around Kerberoasting and Blue Keep and all the different vulns that allowed you to gain information and then leverage that to pivot to the cloud. If you go back to SolarWinds, the SolarWinds compromisation started through the edge of the front end of the Exchange server through a Duo handshake on SAML. You start getting into this understanding that if I lose some of that tech anchor, I lose some of the surface that I had there to be attacked upon, right? In a lot of ways too. And that's the tech that I think that affects our customers. And in that middle theory, most MSPs were fairly immature. Most MSPs weren't going to walk up and go, hey, Eric, do you guys meet ASVS level 1? What's your code look like? How are you developing code? You would have never had that question 3 years ago, right? But you're now hearing it. I was one asking it. You were one asking it. We have MSPs asking it today about Pax8. And what I'm so proud of being here, and you know, I don't like shameless plugs. It's not my style, but I couldn't work somewhere where I didn't get to go to sleep knowing that we were staying as close to that edge as we could around tech debt and around innovation debt. You know, when I first walked in, you guys were carving apart monoliths to create service-oriented architecture to be able to create some of that modern capability, right? And that to me was just one of the things that I think a lot of companies have rested on their laurels, as you said, cashed the check and put it in the debt bucket, right? And had not focused forward. And I think some of the providers that have been in our industry are going to have a hard time overcoming that tech debt if they don't move quick. So this is also focused at you, the vendor. Lean in, be transparent, be humble, move forward, grow, right? And you'll move forward and you'll win. So that's all I've really got on the subject. If you want to close us out, either Eric or Dom, and then we'll wrap it up. Anything else to say?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a lot more to throw in on that. I think this was a really, really great topic, and I appreciate you guys all having me on the show. I enjoyed being here. I enjoyed talking about it. So, like we're gonna keep working on this, and if I have my druthers, this isn't gonna be my first time here to talk about this stuff. So we're gonna keep after everybody. This is near and dear to our heart. We care a lot about improving security for the world, and if nothing else, man, you can sleep well at night if you can feel good about that part of your life, that you're improving the world in a material way. And I think we can sleep well.
That's why I love you, brother. I really appreciate it. All right, I'm gonna close this out. I want to say thank you for being here. We appreciate you coming and watching every week and listening to my diatribe and soapboxes and Dom getting on his. But we really appreciate everything you do. We really love the MSP community for caring so much to innovate and to drive forward these small to mid-sized businesses so that when they go home to their kids, they can be proud of what they do. And that's what matters. And I really appreciate y'all. Please, please, please subscribe, like all the fun algorithm things that help keep our face at the top of your channel. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.